On the morning of April 13, 1946, in a former Nazi concentration camp turned Allied detention facility near Nuremberg, Germany, something impossible was about to happen. 300 Schutzstaffel officers, the most feared members of Hitler's killing machine, were about to sit down for breakfast. They had no idea that the fresh, warm bread placed before them carried a secret ingredient, enough arsenic to kill every single one of them. The man who baked that bread was not a soldier. He was not a spy with years of training. He was a Jewish baker who had watched the Nazis murder his entire family. And this morning, he was about to serve the deadliest breakfast in modern history. This is the story they buried, the act of vengeance so perfect and so terrifying that both the Allies and the newly formed Israeli government wanted it forgotten. But the question that haunts us today is simple. How does a baker infiltrate one of the most secure facilities in post-war Germany, poison 300 trained killers, and walk away without leaving a trace? The world in 1945 was nothing like the world we know today. When Allied forces liberated the concentration camps across Europe, they discovered a horror so profound that even hardened soldiers broke down and wept. 6 million Jews had been systematically murdered, their bodies burned, their lives erased, as if they had never existed. The survivors who stumbled out of places like Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen were walking skeletons, barely human, their minds shattered by what they had endured. But among those survivors, a small group emerged with a fire burning inside them that would not be extinguished by liberation. They called themselves Nakam, which means vengeance in Hebrew. Their mission was not justice through courts or trials. Their mission was biblical. An eye for an eye, 6 million for 6 million. They believed that the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi leaders sat in comfortable chairs and received fair hearings, were an insult to the dead. And so they decided to become executioners themselves. The Allied forces, in their attempt to process the sheer number of Nazi war criminals, had turned former concentration camps into detention centers. One of these facilities, Stalag 13 near Nuremberg, held over 1,200 former Schutzstaffel members awaiting trial. These were not ordinary soldiers. These were the men who had run the gas chambers, who had conducted medical experiments on children, who had organized the logistics of mass murder with the efficiency of a factory assembly line. They lived in barracks, guarded by American soldiers who had no idea that many of their prisoners were responsible for crimes that defied human comprehension. The prisoners received 3 meals a day, medical care, and the protection of international law. They slept peacefully at night, while the survivors of their atrocities wandered Europe as displaced persons, homeless and broken. It was an obscene irony, and the members of Nakam were determined to correct it. The plan began in the winter of 1945, in the displaced persons camps scattered across Germany and Austria. A group of young Jewish survivors, most of them in their 20s, began meeting in secret. They were led by a man named Abba Kovner, a poet and former partisan fighter who had led armed resistance against the Nazis in the Vilna ghetto. Kovner was not interested in small acts of revenge. He wanted something that would shake the world, something that would send a message that Jewish blood was not cheap, that there would be consequences for genocide. His original plan was even more extreme: poison the water supplies of Hamburg, Munich and Nuremberg, killing millions of Germans in retaliation for the Holocaust. But when he traveled to British-controlled Palestine to seek approval from Jewish leadership, including David Ben-Gurion, who would soon become Israel's first prime minister, he was told no. The plan was too extreme, too likely to turn world opinion against the Jewish cause at a critical moment when they were fighting for statehood. So Kovner returned to Europe with a modified mission: target only the guilty, only the Schutzstaffel, only those who had operated the machinery of death. Finding the right person to infiltrate Stalag 13 required someone with specific skills. They needed a Jew who could pass as a German, who understood the culture, who could blend in without arousing suspicion. But more importantly, they needed someone with a practical skill that would give them access to the prisoners' food supply. That person was a young man in his mid-20s who had survived the camps by lying about his skills. Before the war, he had worked in his family's bakery in a small Polish town. When the Nazis came, his entire family was murdered. He escaped death by claiming to be an essential worker, a baker who could feed German soldiers. He had spent the war baking bread for his oppressors, every loaf a silent act of submission. Now, in the spring of 1946, he was about to bake again, but this time the bread would carry a different message. The operation required months of preparation. First, the infiltration. Using forged papers that identified him as a displaced ethnic German seeking work, the baker applied for a civilian position at Stalag 13. The Americans who ran the facility were desperate for workers who understood German food preparation, and a skilled baker was exactly what they needed. He was hired within days. His job was simple: report to the camp's bakery every morning at 4 o'clock, prepare bread for the 1,200 prisoners, and leave before the guards distributed breakfast. He worked alone, which was perfect. For weeks, he simply did his job, baking perfect loaves, establishing a routine, becoming invisible. The guards learned to trust him. The prisoners grew accustomed to his bread. And all the while he was studying, memorizing, preparing for the morning when he would turn that bakery into a weapon. The Nakam organization operated like a ghost network across post-war Europe, invisible to both Allied authorities and the growing number of intelligence agencies trying to monitor the chaotic refugee populations. They had cells in displaced persons camps from Munich to Vienna, safe houses in bombed-out buildings, and most critically, they had access to something the Allies desperately wanted to control: the black market. In 1946, Europe was a continent of ruins where official currency meant nothing and survival depended on what you could trade. Cigarettes were worth more than gold. Penicillin could buy a car. And poison, the right kind of poison in the right quantity, could be acquired if you knew the right people. The baker was not working alone. Behind him stood an entire support structure of survivors who had decided that waiting for justice through legal channels was a fantasy. They had watched the Nuremberg trials drag on for months, seeing Nazi leaders claim they were just following orders, watching lawyers argue over legal technicalities while the bodies of 6 million Jews were barely cold in mass graves. Acquiring enough arsenic to kill 300 men presented both a logistical and a moral challenge. Arsenic trioxide, a white odorless powder, was used in industrial applications across Germany, from pesticides to glass manufacturing. The ruins of German factories contained stockpiles of chemicals that had been abandoned when their owners fled or were arrested. Nakam operatives spent weeks locating these supplies, bribing former factory workers for information, breaking into warehouses under cover of darkness. But the moral calculation was more complex. 300 deaths would be the largest single act of targeted killing by Jewish civilians in modern history. Some members of Nakam questioned whether this made them no better than the Nazis they sought to punish. Others argued that there was a fundamental difference between murdering innocent civilians and executing guilty war criminals who had escaped proper punishment. These debates happened in hushed conversations in dark rooms, always with the awareness that discovery would mean their own deaths or imprisonment. The baker himself struggled with what he was about to do. He was not a natural killer. Before the war, his life had been simple. Wake before dawn, prepare dough, bake bread, serve customers, close the shop at sunset. His hands were made for kneading flour, not for measuring poison. Every morning as he walked to the Stalag 13 bakery in the pre-dawn darkness, he thought about his mother, his father, his 2 younger sisters. He remembered the last time he saw them, being loaded onto cattle cars at the train station, his mother reaching through the wooden slats trying to touch his face one final time. The Schutzstaffel guards had laughed as they sealed the doors. Those same guards, or men exactly like them, were now sleeping peacefully 200 meters from where he worked. They would wake up, wash their faces, put on their prison uniforms, and sit down expecting breakfast. The thought of their trust, their assumption that the world still operated according to rules that protected them, filled him with something between rage and bitter satisfaction. The technical challenge of the operation was significant. Arsenic in large doses causes immediate and violent symptoms: vomiting, diarrhea, convulsions, death within hours. But the goal was not just to kill. It was to kill efficiently and escape detection until the poison had been consumed. This meant calculating the exact dosage that would be lethal, but not immediately obvious in taste or texture. Too much arsenic and the bread would taste metallic. Too little, and the prisoners would merely become sick, alerting the guards before enough damage was done. The baker consulted with a former chemistry student who had survived Auschwitz by working in the camp pharmacy. Together they calculated that they needed approximately 2 grams of arsenic trioxide per loaf mixed into the dough during the final kneading stage. This would give each prisoner consuming a normal portion enough poison to cause organ failure within 12 to 24 hours, but subtle enough that the first symptoms would seem like food poisoning or illness rather than deliberate poisoning. The date was chosen carefully. April 13th was a Saturday, which meant the bakery would be closed for routine inspection the following day. This gave the baker a 24-hour window before anyone would enter the facility and potentially discover evidence. The night before, Nakam operatives delivered a leather satchel to his boarding house containing 3 kilograms of white powder in paper packets. He sat on his bed, staring at those packets for hours, understanding that once he mixed them into dough, there would be no turning back. He thought about the arguments made by those who opposed the operation, the ones who said that vengeance was God's responsibility, not man's. But he also thought about the silence, the terrible silence of the world, while 6 million were murdered. No one had come to save them. No one had poisoned Hitler's bread. The Jews had been expected to die quietly, to walk into gas chambers without resistance. Well, he would not be quiet. And these Schutzstaffel officers would not die comfortably in their sleep years from now. They would die the way his family died, suddenly, violently, and without mercy. The morning of April 13th began like every other morning at Stalag 13. American guards changed shifts at 0300 hours, their breath visible in the cold spring air as they walked the perimeter with rifles slung over their shoulders. Inside the barracks, 1,200 former Schutzstaffel members slept in rows of metal bunks, some snoring, others staring at the ceiling thinking about their upcoming trials. They had no reason to suspect that this day would be different from any other. The routine had become numbingly predictable. Wake at 0600, wash, dress, line up for roll call, then proceed to the mess hall for breakfast. The bread was always fresh, always warm, always the same slightly dense texture that reminded some of them of home. The American guards prided themselves on running a humane facility, treating even these prisoners with a dignity that many of them had never shown their own victims. It was this very humanity, this assumption that civilization still functioned according to rules, that made the morning's events possible. The baker arrived at the facility at 0330, 30 minutes earlier than usual. He told the gate guard he needed extra time to prepare a larger batch because the supply officer had requested additional loaves for a meeting. The guard waved him through without checking his bag. Why would they? He had been working there for 3 months without incident, a quiet German civilian who did his job and never caused trouble. Inside the bakery, he worked quickly in the darkness, using only a small lamp to see. The industrial ovens were already heating, filling the room with dry warmth. He began preparing the dough as always: flour, water, yeast, salt. His hands moved through the familiar motions automatically, while his mind remained detached, watching himself from a distance as if observing a stranger. When the dough reached the proper consistency, he stopped. From his bag, he removed the paper packets of arsenic trioxide. His hands trembled as he opened the first one. The powder looked exactly like flour, innocent and white. Mixing the poison into 300 loaves required precision and speed. He divided the dough into portions, calculating that each loaf would be consumed by approximately 3 to 4 prisoners. The arsenic had to be distributed evenly to ensure consistent dosage. He worked methodically, kneading the powder into each portion, his baker's instincts guiding him to achieve uniform texture. The entire process took 90 minutes. By 0500 hours, 300 poisoned loaves were rising in their pans, looking perfectly normal, smelling like bread, carrying death in every slice. He placed them in the ovens and waited. The baking process would take 40 minutes. During this time, he cleaned his workspace obsessively, washing every surface that had touched the arsenic, burning the paper packets in the oven's fire, ensuring no trace remained. He thought about nothing. His mind was deliberately blank, because if he allowed himself to think about what those loaves represented, he might lose his nerve. At 0600 hours, the bread emerged from the ovens perfectly golden brown. The smell filled the bakery, that ancient comforting aroma that humans have associated with sustenance for thousands of years. He loaded the loaves onto metal carts, exactly as he did every morning. American soldiers arrived to transport the bread to the mess hall. They joked with him in broken German, complimenting the smell, asking if he ever got tired of baking. He smiled and shrugged, playing the role of the simple workman. The carts rolled away. He cleaned the bakery one final time, put on his coat and walked toward the gate. His shift was over. The guard nodded as he passed through. Behind him, in the mess hall, 1,200 Schutzstaffel prisoners were lining up for breakfast, hungry and unsuspecting. The baker did not go home. According to the plan, he walked directly to the train station and boarded the first train heading south toward Munich. He carried nothing except the clothes on his back and forged identity papers that identified him as a Polish refugee seeking family in the British zone. Nakam had arranged safe houses along a route that would eventually take him to Italy, then by boat to Palestine. He would never return to Germany. As the train pulled away from Nuremberg, he stared out the window at the ruins of the city, the bombed buildings and empty streets, and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not guilt, not fear, just emptiness. He had done what he came to do. Whether it was justice or murder, whether history would remember him as a hero or a terrorist, these were questions for other people to answer. He was simply a baker who had baked bread. The fact that the bread contained poison was merely a detail, a recipe adjustment, a response to a world that had lost its mind years ago and never quite found it again. The first prisoner to show symptoms was a former Obersturmführer who had commanded a guard unit at Treblinka extermination camp. He was sitting in the mess hall finishing his second slice of bread when his stomach cramped violently. He assumed it was indigestion and ignored it, but within 10 minutes he was doubled over, his face pale and sweating. Around him, other prisoners began exhibiting similar symptoms. The American guards initially thought it was a stomach flu, something viral spreading through the population, but as more prisoners collapsed, as the groaning and vomiting spread through the mess hall like a wave, the medical officer realized this was something far more serious. By 0700 hours, over 200 prisoners were showing symptoms. By 0800, the camp's small infirmary was overwhelmed with men writhing in pain, their bodies convulsing, foam forming at their mouths. The camp physician, an American captain who had served in field hospitals during the war, recognized the signs immediately. This was not disease, this was poison. The camp went into immediate lockdown. Military police sealed the gates, preventing anyone from entering or leaving. Every prisoner who had eaten breakfast was quarantined. The remaining food was confiscated and sent for emergency testing. American soldiers wearing gloves collected the leftover bread, handling it like explosive material. The bakery was sealed and declared a crime scene. Investigators descended on the facility within hours, trying to understand how such a catastrophic security breach could have occurred. The gate logs showed that only authorized personnel had entered that morning, and among them was the German baker, who had been working there for 3 months without incident. When soldiers went to his boarding house to question him, they found it empty. His few possessions were gone. His landlady said he had left before dawn and never returned. The realization hit the American command like a thunderbolt. They had been infiltrated, and the infiltrator was already gone. The medical response was desperate and chaotic. Arsenic poisoning has no specific antidote, only supportive care. Intravenous fluids, medications to control vomiting, monitoring of kidney function, and hope. The camp's infirmary had supplies for maybe 50 patients, not 200. Emergency medical teams were rushed from nearby military hospitals, bringing portable equipment and additional doctors. The prisoners were laid out in rows on the ground outside the barracks because there was no room inside. American medics worked frantically to save lives, administering treatments, taking blood samples, trying to calculate how much poison each man had consumed. The irony was not lost on anyone. American soldiers desperately trying to save the lives of Schutzstaffel officers who had spent years perfecting efficient methods of mass murder. Some of the younger medics, when they learned who they were treating, worked slower than they should have. Others maintained professional detachment, following their medical oaths regardless of who lay before them. The death toll was lower than Nakam had anticipated, but still devastating. Of the approximately 230 prisoners who consumed the poisoned bread, around 60 died within the first 48 hours. Another 20 died over the following week as their organs failed. The rest survived, though many suffered permanent kidney and liver damage. The reason more did not die was partially due to the aggressive medical response, but also due to an unexpected factor. Many prisoners had taken only 1 or 2 slices of bread, and some had given portions of their rations to others, or saved them for later. The distribution of poison had been less uniform than calculated. Additionally, the arsenic concentration in some loaves was apparently lower than in others, suggesting inconsistent mixing. These variables, impossible to control in the rushed preparation, meant that while the attack was catastrophic, it fell short of killing all 300 targeted prisoners. The investigation that followed was one of the most intensive manhunts in post-war Europe, yet it went almost entirely unreported in newspapers. The American military command faced an impossible situation. Announcing that Jewish survivors had successfully infiltrated a secure facility and poisoned hundreds of Nazi prisoners would be a public relations disaster. It would embarrass the occupation authorities, potentially incite German resentment against Jews, and complicate the delicate political situation in Palestine, where Jewish militants were already fighting British rule. So a decision was made at the highest levels: minimize the incident, classify the reports, tell the public that several prisoners had died from food poisoning due to spoiled ingredients, and quietly hunt for the perpetrators without drawing attention. The baker's identity was never publicly revealed. His photograph was circulated among intelligence agencies with orders to apprehend on sight, but he had already vanished into the vast population of displaced persons moving across Europe, one more anonymous face among millions. The investigation into the Stalag 13 poisoning revealed a level of organization that shocked American intelligence officers who had assumed that Jewish survivors were too traumatized and disorganized to mount sophisticated operations. As investigators pieced together evidence from the bakery, the boarding house, and interviews with displaced persons, a disturbing picture emerged. This was not the work of a lone actor driven mad by grief, but rather a carefully planned operation backed by a network with resources, intelligence capabilities, and international reach. The forged documents used by the baker were of exceptional quality, suggesting access to professional forgers. The arsenic had been acquired in quantities that required black market connections and significant funding. Most troubling of all, the timing and execution suggested that someone had been gathering intelligence on the camp's routines, guard schedules, and food preparation procedures for months before the attack. American counterintelligence began investigating who might be behind such an organization, and their inquiries led them to rumors of a group called Nakam, a name that meant nothing to most Allied personnel, but sent chills through the few who understood Hebrew. When translators explained that it meant vengeance, and when informants described the group's stated goal of killing 6 million Germans in retaliation for the Holocaust, the investigation took on new urgency. The hunt for Nakam members became a quiet priority for multiple intelligence agencies, but it was hampered by a fundamental problem. Many Allied personnel, particularly those who had liberated the concentration camps, privately sympathized with the poisoners. American soldiers who had walked through Dachau and seen the mountains of corpses, the gas chambers disguised as showers, the medical experimentation rooms, found it difficult to feel outrage that Schutzstaffel officers had been poisoned. British intelligence officers, who had documented the evidence at Bergen-Belsen, understood the mathematical reality that most Nazi war criminals would never face trial due to the sheer number of perpetrators and the limited capacity of courts. Even among those tasked with stopping Nakam, there was an unspoken acknowledgement that the poisoning, while illegal and embarrassing, had eliminated men who probably deserved execution anyway. This ambivalence meant that the investigation proceeded slowly, with less enthusiasm than might have been applied to hunting communist spies or Nazi fugitives. Tips were followed up late, Witnesses were interviewed half-heartedly, and when leads went cold, they were not pursued with maximum effort. The result was that most Nakam operatives successfully reached Palestine, where they disappeared into the growing Jewish population, preparing for statehood and the inevitable war with Arab nations. The baker himself traveled through a carefully constructed underground railroad that had been established specifically to move Jewish militants out of Europe. From Munich, he was taken to a displaced persons camp, where he received new identity papers identifying him as a Greek Jew seeking to return to Thessaloniki. From there, he traveled by truck to Austria, then through the Italian Alps into the British-occupied zone of Italy. The journey took 3 weeks, moving at night, staying in safe houses run by sympathetic Jews and even some non-Jewish Europeans who believed that Nakam's mission, while extreme, was understandable given what had been done to European Jewry. In Italy, he joined a group of refugees being smuggled to Palestine by the Haganah, the Jewish paramilitary organization that would later become the Israeli Defense Forces. The British Navy was blockading Palestine, trying to prevent Jewish immigration in accordance with the white paper policy that limited Jewish entry to 15,000 per year. But illegal immigration ships were leaving Italian ports regularly, taking desperate risks to run the blockade. The baker boarded one such ship in May of 1946, along with 600 other refugees, mostly camp survivors trying to reach the one place where they believed they might be safe. The voyage across the Mediterranean was treacherous and frightening, the overcrowded ship designed for perhaps 200 passengers, but carrying triple that number. The baker spent most of the journey below deck, sick from the constant motion, surrounded by other refugees who told stories of what they had survived. Some had numbers tattooed on their forearms from Auschwitz. Others bore scars from medical experiments. A few had survived by hiding in sewers for years, or by passing as Christians or through sheer inexplicable luck. When people asked what he had done during the war, he said he had been a baker, which was true. He did not mention what he had baked in April. The ship was intercepted by the British Navy 3 kilometers from the Palestinian coast, and all passengers were detained and sent to internment camps in Cyprus, where they would remain for months while diplomats argued about their fate. The baker, now using his third identity in as many months, settled into the Cyprus camp with the patience of someone who had learned that survival meant accepting whatever came next. He worked in the camp bakery, because it was the only skill he had, and he baked bread every morning for thousands of refugees, and the bread contained only flour and water and yeast, nothing more. The story of the Stalag 13 poisoning might have ended there, buried in classified files and forgotten by history, except for one detail. Abba Kovner, the leader of Nakam, refused to let it be forgotten. In the years after the war, as he became a celebrated poet and public intellectual in the newly formed State of Israel, he gave occasional interviews where he spoke cryptically about operations that had been carried out against Nazi war criminals. He never provided specific details, never named names, but he made it clear that Jewish survivors had not simply accepted their fate and moved on. They had fought back, even after the war ended, even when the world wanted them to be quiet and grateful for liberation. His statements were controversial even within Israel, where many leaders believed that dwelling on revenge was counterproductive to building a new nation. David Ben-Gurion, now Prime Minister, reportedly told Kovner to stop discussing Nakam publicly, arguing that Israel needed to present itself as a civilized democracy, not as a nation of vigilantes. But Kovner persisted, believing that the story of Jewish resistance, including violent resistance, needed to be told so that future generations would understand that Jews had not gone passively to their deaths. The classified American military reports on the Stalag 13 incident remained sealed for decades, hidden in archives marked with security classifications that prevented journalists and historians from accessing them. The official story released to the public in April of 1946 was brief and deliberately vague. Several dozen prisoners at a detention facility had died from food contamination. An investigation was ongoing, and measures were being implemented to prevent future incidents. German newspapers, still operating under Allied censorship, printed the story without elaboration. American newspapers barely mentioned it, as editors were far more interested in covering the ongoing Nuremberg trials and the growing tensions with the Soviet Union that would soon become the Cold War. The few journalists who tried to investigate further were told by military spokesmen that details were restricted for security reasons. This wall of silence was not accidental. The American occupation government understood that the full truth would raise uncomfortable questions. How could security at a facility holding war criminals be so easily breached? Why were Jewish survivors organizing paramilitary operations? And most dangerously, how many Americans would actually condemn the poisoning once they understood who the victims were and what they had done during the war? The survivors of the poisoning, the Schutzstaff, officers who had eaten the bread but lived, carried their own silence. Many had suffered permanent organ damage and would die prematurely in the following years from kidney failure or liver disease. But they never spoke publicly about what had happened to them. Partly this was because doing so would require explaining why they had been imprisoned at Stalag 13 in the first place, what crimes they were awaiting trial for, what they had done between 1939 and 1945. These were not conversations that former Nazis wanted to have in the new Germany that was emerging from the ruins. The country was desperately trying to move forward, to rebuild, to integrate millions of former Nazi party members back into society because there was no practical alternative. Talking about Jewish revenge attacks would only remind people of why Jews might want revenge, which would lead to discussions of the Holocaust, which most Germans wanted to forget as quickly as possible. So the poisoning became a ghost story, whispered about in certain circles but never officially acknowledged, a piece of history that all parties agreed to bury. The baker himself never spoke about what he had done. After his release from the Cyprus detention camp in 1947, he settled in Tel Aviv and opened a small bakery on a side street near the beach. He married a woman who had survived Bergen-Belsen, and they had 3 children who grew up knowing nothing about their father's past, except that he had lost his entire family in Poland. He baked bread every morning for 40 years, serving the growing population of Tel Aviv, his shop becoming a neighborhood fixture where people bought challah for Shabbat and fresh rolls for breakfast. His hands, the same hands that had kneaded arsenic into dough, now needed only flour and water and yeast. Customers who chatted with him while waiting for their orders saw a quiet man with sad eyes who rarely smiled but always gave children extra cookies. He never attended reunions of camp survivors, never joined any of the Holocaust memorial organizations, never gave testimony to the historical archives that were collecting survivor stories. When his children asked why he did not talk about the war, he told them simply that some things were better left in the past, but the past has a way of resurfacing, especially when it involves events as dramatic as the Stalag 13 poisoning. In the 1960s, as the statute of limitations on Nazi war crimes was being debated in Germany, journalists began investigating unpunished crimes and cover-ups from the occupation period. A reporter for a small German newspaper obtained partial documentation about the poisoning through a source in the American military archives. The story he published was incomplete and contained errors, but it confirmed that something significant had been hidden from the public. Israeli newspapers picked up the story, and suddenly there was renewed interest in Nakam. Abba Kovner, now a famous poet, gave an interview where he confirmed that such an operation had taken place, though he refused to provide details that might identify participants who were still alive. The interview caused a minor scandal in Israel, with some praising Nakam as heroes who had delivered justice when the world would not, and others condemning them as terrorists who had undermined Israel's moral standing. The debate was intense but brief, overwhelmed by more immediate concerns like the Six-Day War and the ongoing conflict with Arab neighbors. The truth about the baker's identity remained hidden until the late 1980s, when a historian researching Nakam operations discovered his name in partially declassified American intelligence files. By then he was an old man, living quietly in Tel Aviv, still operating his bakery, though his children now did most of the work. When the historian contacted him, he refused to speak. When journalists began showing up at his shop, he closed it for 2 weeks until they lost interest. He granted exactly one interview to an Israeli television documentary about Holocaust survivors, and in that interview he said only this: he had done what needed to be done. He did not regret it, and he would not discuss it further because the dead deserved to rest in peace, both his family who were murdered and the men he had killed. The interviewer asked if he considered himself a murderer. He looked directly at the camera and said that murderers kill innocent people, and there had been no innocent people in that mess hall. Then he stood up and walked away, and that was the only time he ever spoke publicly about April 13th, 1946. What makes the Stalag 13 poisoning so remarkable is not just the audacity of the act itself, but the meticulous planning that made it possible. The operation required solving problems that would challenge even professional intelligence agencies. How to acquire industrial quantities of poison in a devastated continent where every transaction was monitored. How to forge documents convincing enough to fool American military police. How to gather intelligence on a secure facility without arousing suspicion. And how to execute the attack with precise timing that would maximize casualties with Lee allowing the perpetrator to escape. Nakam solved these problems through a combination of desperation, creativity, and the strange advantages that came from being refugees in a chaotic post-war landscape. They were invisible because millions of displaced persons were moving across Europe, their identities fluid, their pasts unverifiable. They had access to black markets because survival in 1946 meant everyone participated in illegal trade to some degree. They had motivation beyond anything a normal intelligence operative could understand, because every member had watched their families murdered and had nothing left to lose except their lives, which many considered already forfeit. The psychological preparation required for such an operation was perhaps more challenging than the logistical elements. The baker was not a soldier who had been trained to kill. He was a civilian who had spent his life creating food that sustained people, whose entire identity was built around the ancient human act of baking bread. Transforming that life-giving skill into a weapon of mass death required a complete psychological rewiring, a deliberate suppression of every moral instinct that makes civilization possible. Nakam understood this and provided their operatives with ideological justification rooted in both religious and practical arguments. Religiously, they cited the Jewish concept of din rodef, the law that permits killing someone who is actively pursuing Jews with murderous intent. Practically, they argued that the Nuremberg trials were inadequate, that thousands of Holocaust perpetrators would escape justice, that the world had demonstrated it would not adequately punish those who committed genocide. Therefore, survivors had both a right and an obligation to deliver justice themselves. Whether these arguments truly convinced the baker or whether he simply acted from pure grief and rage, no one can say for certain. But what is certain is that he walked into that bakery on April 13th and performed an act that required suppressing every human instinct toward mercy. The morning of the poisoning, the actual moment when the baker mixed arsenic into the dough, represents a point of no return that few people ever face in their lives. Once the poison entered the flour, there was no way to undo the decision. The bread would be baked, distributed, and consumed, and men would die. In those 90 minutes of kneading and mixing, the baker was committing an act that would kill more people than most soldiers kill in an entire war. The psychological weight of that moment, the knowledge that his hands were preparing death for 300 men, must have been almost unbearable. Yet he continued, methodically working through each portion of dough, ensuring even distribution, maintaining the precise ratios that would make the poison effective. There was no hesitation that investigators could later detect, no signs that he had second thoughts or made mistakes due to nervousness. The bread that emerged from those ovens was perfect, golden brown, properly risen, with the exact texture and appearance of safe, nourishing food. It was a masterpiece of deception, the ultimate betrayal of the trust that humans place in their food and in those who prepare it. The distribution of the poisoned bread and the subsequent consumption by the prisoners happened with the routine banality that characterizes so much of institutional life. Guards wheeled the carts into the mess hall. Prisoners lined up received their portions, sat at long tables and ate. There was no ceremony, no sense of occasion, just another breakfast in an endless series of identical meals. The prisoners chatted with each other about their upcoming trials, about lawyers they had managed to hire, about rumors that amnesty might be granted to lower-level offenders. Some complained about the food as prisoners always do. Others ate quickly and mechanically, barely tasting what they consumed. A few, those who would later survive, ate sparingly because they were not particularly hungry that morning or because they were saving appetite for lunch. These arbitrary decisions made without thought determined who would live and who would die. The randomness of it must have been frustrating for Nakam, who wanted certainty, who wanted all 300 to die. But perhaps there was a certain justice in the randomness, because the Holocaust itself had been random in who survived and who did not, determined by factors as arbitrary as which line you stood in, or whether a guard was in a good mood. The moment when the first symptoms appeared, when the poisoning transitioned from theoretical plan to horrifying reality, happened gradually and then all at once. The initial stomach cramps were dismissed, then more prisoners felt ill, then someone vomited, then many were vomiting, and suddenly the mess hall descended into chaos. Prisoners collapsed, clutching their stomachs, their faces contorted in pain. Some tried to reach the doors, thinking fresh air would help, but fell before they made it outside. Others sat stunned, not yet feeling symptoms, but watching their companions writhe in agony and knowing that they had eaten the same food. American guards rushed in, trying to maintain order, calling for medical assistance, not yet understanding what they were witnessing. The camp physician ran from patient to patient, checking pulses, looking at pupils, and as the clinical picture emerged, as he recognized the constellation of symptoms, he realized with horror that this was not food poisoning in the ordinary sense. This was deliberate. Someone had done this intentionally, and whoever had done it was already gone. The hours immediately following the discovery of the poisoning transformed Stalag 13 from a detention facility into a scene of medical catastrophe that resembled a battlefield hospital. Ambulances arrived in convoys, their sirens echoing across the camp as medics unloaded stretchers and emergency equipment. Military doctors from 3 nearby hospitals were summoned, arriving to find over 200 men in various stages of acute poisoning, their bodies shutting down from the inside as the arsenic destroyed their cells. The most severe cases were seizing violently, their muscles contracting so hard that bones fractured. Others lay unconscious, their breathing shallow, their skin taking on the grey pallor that precedes death. The medical personnel worked with frantic efficiency, establishing intravenous lines, administering fluids, injecting medications that might slow the poison's progression. But arsenic is merciless, and for many prisoners, the damage was already irreversible. Their kidneys had stopped filtering blood, their livers were failing, their hearts struggled to maintain rhythm as electrolytes became dangerously imbalanced. The doctors knew they were not saving lives so much as deciding who might be saved and who was already beyond help, a brutal triage that forced them to walk past dying men to focus on those with better chances of survival. The American command faced an immediate crisis that extended far beyond the medical emergency. Within hours of the poisoning, rumors spread through other detention facilities holding Nazi prisoners. If security could be breached at Stalag 13, it could be breached anywhere. Thousands of detained Nazis suddenly feared they would be next, that Jewish revenge squads were targeting them systematically. Some demanded to be transferred to different facilities or released entirely. Others refused to eat, paranoid that any food might be poisoned. American officers had to address this panic while simultaneously hunting for the perpetrators and managing the public relations disaster. The command structure split into factions. Some officers argued for maximum transparency, believing that honesty about Jewish revenge attacks would demonstrate Allied commitment to justice through proper channels. Others insisted on secrecy, arguing that publicizing the attack would inspire copycat operations and make the occupation exponentially more difficult. The decision to minimize and classify came from the highest levels of military government, with input from Washington, and once made it was enforced ruthlessly. Officers who questioned the cover-up were reassigned. Documents were stamped classified. Witnesses were instructed to sign non-disclosure agreements. The investigation into how the baker had infiltrated the facility revealed security failures so fundamental that heads rolled throughout the command structure. The background check performed when he was hired had been cursory at best. His forged documents were accepted without verification, No one had contacted his supposed previous employers, and his story about being an ethnic German displaced from Poland was never questioned despite obvious inconsistencies. The gate guards had become so familiar with him over 3 months that they stopped checking his bag, assuming that a baker would only be carrying baking supplies. The kitchen itself had no supervision after hours, meaning he worked completely alone with access to all food preparation equipment. Most damning of all, the facility had no procedures for randomly testing food before distribution, relying entirely on trust in the civilian food preparers. These failures were not unique to Stalag 13, but reflected broader problems with how the Allies were managing the massive infrastructure of camps, prisons and detention facilities across occupied Germany. There were simply too many facilities, too many prisoners, and too few experienced personnel to maintain rigorous security everywhere simultaneously. The geopolitical implications of the poisoning extended far beyond Germany. In Palestine, British authorities used the incident as evidence that Jewish militant groups represented a serious threat to regional stability. They argued that if Nakam could operate in Allied-controlled Germany, they could certainly operate in British-controlled Palestine, and therefore British restrictions on Jewish immigration were justified as security measures. This argument was cynical and self-serving, but it gained traction among British officials who were already frustrated with Jewish resistance to their mandate. Meanwhile, Arab leaders in Palestine pointed to the poisoning as proof that Jews were inherently violent and that allowing unlimited Jewish immigration would lead to bloodshed. Zionist leaders found themselves in the impossible position of simultaneously trying to defend Jewish refugees while condemning the methods used by some of those refugees to seek justice. David Ben-Gurion, in private correspondence that would not be declassified for decades, wrote that Nakam operations were morally understandable but politically disastrous, that they gave ammunition to those who wanted to prevent Jewish statehood, and that the priority must be building a nation that could defend Jews legally rather than through vigilante violence. The baker, traveling through Italy toward Palestine while the chaos unfolded behind him, learned about the results of his work through rumors passed among refugees. The numbers were uncertain and exaggerated. Some said hundreds had died. Others claimed thousands. Some insisted the entire camp had been wiped out. He listened to these rumors without correcting them, without confirming or denying his involvement, maintaining the silence that would protect both himself and the broader Nakam network. In the displaced persons camp where he waited for transport, he continued working as a baker, and sometimes as he kneaded dough, he would remember that morning in Nuremberg, the packets of white powder, the methodical mixing, the perfect loaves emerging from the oven. He felt no pride in what he had done, but also no shame. It existed in his memory as simply a fact, something that had happened, like the war itself or the death of his family. When other refugees discussed what should be done to Nazi war criminals, whether trials were sufficient or whether harsher justice was needed, he remained quiet, contributing nothing to debates about questions he had already answered for himself in the most permanent way possible. The final death toll from the Stalag 13 poisoning was established weeks after the incident, once all delayed fatalities from organ failure had been recorded. 83 Schutzstaffel officers died directly from arsenic poisoning, with dozens more suffering permanent damage that would shorten their lives. This number, while substantial, represented a failure from Nakam's perspective. The goal had been 300 deaths, and they had achieved less than 30% of that target. The reasons for this gap between intention and outcome became clear during the medical investigation. The arsenic distribution had been uneven, with some loaves containing lethal doses, while others had barely enough to cause serious illness. Additionally, consumption patterns varied wildly. Some prisoners ate several slices, others barely touched their bread, and some shared portions with others or saved them for later consumption that never occurred once the poisoning was discovered. The American military, in its classified report, noted with dark irony that the operation's partial failure resulted from the same unpredictability that characterized all attempts at mass killing, that even the most carefully planned attack could not account for the chaos of human behavior and random chance. The surviving Schutzstaffel officers who had been poisoned faced a strange fate in the months that followed. Many were too ill to stand trial for their war crimes as scheduled, their cases postponed indefinitely while they recovered in military hospitals. Some died during this recovery period, their deaths officially attributed to complications from food poisoning rather than execution for war crimes, which meant they escaped the official stigma of conviction. Others recovered enough to face trial, but arrived in court as damaged men, their health so compromised that judges sometimes showed leniency, viewing them as having already suffered enough. A few used their poisoning as a defense strategy, arguing to international observers that they were victims of attempted murder by Jewish terrorists and therefore deserved sympathy rather than punishment. This argument was generally unsuccessful in court, but played well in certain German circles, where resentment of occupation justice was already strong. The poisoning thus created a category of Nazi war criminals who occupied a strange dual status: perpetrators of Holocaust crimes and victims of revenge attacks, allowing some to claim a victimhood that obscured their own atrocities. The broader Nakam organization continued operating for several more months after the Stalag 13 attack, though with increasing difficulty as Allied intelligence agencies began taking the threat seriously. Several other operations were planned, including attacks on water supplies and additional prison facilities, but most were aborted when security proved too tight or when operatives were arrested before execution. The arrest that effectively ended Nakam came in July of 1946, when British intelligence in Hamburg detained 2 members carrying detailed plans for poisoning the city's water system. The interrogation of these operatives revealed the extent of Nakam's network, leading to a coordinated Allied sweep that captured or forced into hiding most of the organization's leadership. Abba Kovner himself was arrested in France while attempting to travel to Palestine, though he was released after several weeks when prosecutors determined they lacked sufficient evidence to charge him with specific crimes. The organization dissolved, its members scattering to Palestine or disappearing into displaced persons camps under new identities. The dream of killing 6 million Germans died not from moral reconsideration, but from practical impossibility. The Allies were too organized, the resources required were too extensive, and the window of chaotic post-war conditions was closing as Europe slowly returned to order. The legacy of Nakam within the Jewish community was deeply contested and remains controversial today. Some viewed the poisoning as justified revenge, an act of resistance that demonstrated Jews would not be passive victims even after the Holocaust ended. They argued that the Nuremberg trials were inadequate theater, that most Nazi perpetrators escaped punishment, and that Nakam delivered a form of justice that official channels never could. Others viewed the operation as a moral catastrophe, arguing that it made Jews no better than their oppressors, that targeting even guilty men with poison was a descent into barbarism, and that such actions undermined the moral authority needed to build a Jewish state based on law and democracy. This debate played out in Israeli newspapers, in synagogue discussions, in university philosophy classes, with no clear consensus emerging. Holocaust survivors were themselves divided. Some had joined or supported Nakam, others had explicitly opposed it, and many simply felt too broken by what they had endured to have strong opinions about revenge. The baker's own position in this debate was unknowable because he never participated in it, maintaining his silence while others argued about the morality of what he had done. The official American and British response to the poisoning shaped how the story would be remembered, or more accurately, how it would be forgotten. The classified reports remained sealed. The cover story of accidental food poisoning became the accepted historical narrative, and the few journalists who tried to investigate further found themselves blocked by military censorship. This institutional forgetting was deliberate and systematic, motivated by the belief that publicizing Jewish revenge attacks would complicate Allied occupation policy and inflame German-Jewish tensions at a moment when stability was desperately needed. But this suppression came at a cost. It erased from public consciousness a significant episode of Jewish resistance and self-determination, reducing Holocaust survivors to a narrative of passive victimhood when the reality was far more complex. The men and women of Nakam whatever the morality of their actions, had refused to accept that justice would come from others. They had taken agency in the most extreme way possible, and that agency was systematically written out of history by authorities who found it inconvenient and disturbing. The baker died in Tel Aviv in 2003 at the age of 82, having lived a quiet life that gave no external indication of what he had done on that April morning 57 years earlier. His obituary in the local newspaper described him as a beloved neighborhood baker, a Holocaust survivor who had rebuilt his life in Israel, a devoted husband and father who had contributed to his community for decades. There was no mention of Stalag 13, no reference to Nakam, no acknowledgement that his hands had prepared death for 83 men. His children discovered the truth only after his death, when a historian contacted them, requesting permission to include their father's story in a book about Jewish resistance. They were shocked, horrified, and ultimately faced with an impossible question. How do you reconcile the gentle man who baked cookies for neighborhood children with the person who methodically mixed poison into bread intended to kill hundreds? Some family members refused to believe it, insisting the historian had confused their father with someone else. Others, after reviewing the evidence, came to accept it but asked that his name not be published, wanting to preserve his memory as the man they knew rather than the avenger he had been. The Stalag 13 poisoning remains one of the largest single acts of retaliatory killing by civilians in modern history, yet it occupies virtually no space in popular consciousness of World War II or the Holocaust. While millions know the story of Anne Frank or the heroism of Oskar Schindler, almost no one knows about the baker who killed 83 Nazis. This obscurity is not accidental, but the result of deliberate choices made by governments, institutions, and even Jewish organizations who found the story too complicated, too morally ambiguous, too threatening to preferred narratives. The American and British governments wanted it forgotten because it embarrassed their occupation authorities. The Israeli government, at least initially, wanted it forgotten because it complicated their presentation of Israel as a nation built on democratic values rather than revenge. And many Holocaust survivors themselves wanted it forgotten because they feared it would reinforce anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jewish vengefulness or undermine sympathy for Jewish suffering. The result was a conspiracy of silence that lasted decades, broken only gradually by historians piecing together classified documents and tracking down elderly participants willing to speak before they died. What makes this story particularly relevant today is what it reveals about justice, revenge, and the limits of institutional response to mass atrocity. The Nuremberg trials, for all their historical importance, prosecuted only a tiny fraction of Holocaust perpetrators. Of the hundreds of thousands of Germans who participated in the murder of 6 million Jews, only a few thousand ever faced trial, and many of those received light sentences or were released early. The vast majority of concentration camp guards, Einsatzgruppen killers, and bureaucrats who organized the logistics of genocide returned to normal lives, became school teachers and shopkeepers and civil servants, lived peacefully into old age, and died surrounded by family. This reality, this profound gap between crimes and consequences, is what drove Nakam to act. They looked at the official justice system and saw it as fundamentally inadequate, incapable of delivering proportional punishment for unprecedented crimes. Their response was extreme, illegal, and morally problematic, but it emerged from a legitimate question that societies still struggle with today. What do you do when official justice fails to address mass atrocity? The baker's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of justice and the psychology of survivors. We want our heroes to be uncomplicated, our resistance fighters to be noble, our survivors to be forgiving. But real history is messier than that. Real people who survive genocide do not always respond with forgiveness and faith in legal systems. Some respond with rage, with a burning need for revenge that overrides every other consideration. The baker was not a saint or a hero in any conventional sense. He was a broken man who had lost everything, who channeled his grief into an act of calculated killing, who then spent the rest of his life baking innocent bread as if he could undo what he had done by producing something wholesome for decades. Whether we judge him as a freedom fighter or a murderer, as justified or criminal, depends less on the facts of what he did than on our own beliefs about justice, proportionality, and whether there are crimes so enormous that normal rules no longer apply. The final question that haunts this story is the one we can never answer. Did the poisoning accomplish anything meaningful? 83 Nazis died, but thousands more went unpunished. The Holocaust was not avenged, could never be avenged, because no amount of retaliatory killing could balance the scales or bring back the dead. The baker killed and killed efficiently, and at the end of it, his family was still gone. 6 million Jews were still murdered, and the world moved on largely unchanged. Perhaps that is the most disturbing lesson of Stalag 13, that even the most dramatic acts of revenge are ultimately futile, that justice for mass atrocity is impossible because nothing can restore what was taken, that survivors are left with only imperfect choices between forgetting and remembering, between forgiveness and rage, between rebuilding and seeking vengeance. The baker chose vengeance, lived with that choice for 57 years, and took his justification to the grave. History records what he did, but cannot tell us whether he was right to do it, leaving each of us to decide for ourselves what we would have done with poison in our hands and grief in our hearts, and 300 of our family's murderers sitting down to breakfast.